Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. Today we are going to be getting super nerdy and geeking out on all of my reading stats for 2022. I live for this stuff, so if this isn't your thing, I'll see you in the next video. I'm going to be looking kind of down this way for most of the video because I have all my stats pulled up on the screen. Apologies in advance for not making eye contact. So let's just get into the good stuff. All right, so I read 61 books this year, which is super exciting. I read 26,193 pages according to Storygraph. So this is the Storygraph. I use this and Goodreads, and I also keep a spreadsheet to track all of my different things. And so I'm going to be using both Storygraph and Goodreads. And then I also made some of my own graphics just based on some spreadsheet stuff that I keep track of separately that I thought was interesting. So as far as my reading moods this year, most of the books that I read were adventurous or dark. And I also had a healthy portion of mysterious, reflective, emotional, and challenging. So the rest of them get pretty small after that. But yeah, I had adventurous and dark. Definitely doesn't surprise me since I am a fantasy sci-fi reader and I read quite a number of dark tales this year. As far as pacing, I had a pretty good mix of most of the books that I read were medium paced. I had slightly more slow paced reads than fast paced reads, but those were pretty evened out in the end. And as far as page number, I had also a pretty good mix. I would say 38% of my books being over 500 pages is pretty solid and standard for fantasy sci-fi. And then I had 46% medium-paced reads and 16% very short reads. That's always nice as well. And then as far as fiction, nonfiction, I had 90% fiction and 10% nonfiction. So I feel like that's a pretty good balance for me. I don't want to read too many nonfictions because reading is a good escape for me, but I do like to learn new things every year, and so nonfiction is a great outlet for that. As far as the format, I did most of my reading digitally this year, which I expect to continue. I absolutely love my Kindle, and halfway through this year in 2023, my husband and I are going to be moving into our van full time, and so I won't be able to take physical books with me at that point, and so I expect most of my reading in 2023 will also be digital. But I did have a good number of print books as well, and 11% of my reading was audio. So if you've been following my channel the last couple months, you know that I, in November, had eye surgery, and so for a while after that, several weeks, I was not able to read physical books, and so I exclusively listened to audiobooks pretty much for the month of November and early December. So that's where all of that comes from. I'm not normally an audiobook listener, but I did find myself really enjoying that this year. And this was the first year that I've ever listened to audiobooks. So yeah, I can see myself doing that again in the future. I really specifically enjoyed nonfiction on audio because that to me just felt like listening to a podcast, which was great. But I found that some of the fiction that I listened to on audio was also really engaging. So that was a surprise for me. And then my most read authors, this comes as no surprise because there are 8 authors on this list and I read 8 series this year. So James S. A. Corey obviously is the leader here because The Expanse is a 9-book series. So that's a good segue into some of my own graphics. So here is my completed series by page count. So I made this to kind of show off the different series that I've read this year. If you want to hear more about these series, I made a video called 8 series that rocked my world in 2022, and I will link that here. For this one, I just wanted to show off the length by page count of each of these series. And so the number outside the circle is the page number of the series overall, and then the number inside the circle is the number of books in that series. So The Expanse is obviously the longest, both by page count and by book count. But The Poppy War was the longest trilogy that I read. The Memoirs of Lady Trent series actually had fairly short books because those were 5 books, and it's right up there with some of the longer trilogies in terms of page count. And then The Kingkiller Chronicles is only 2 books, but was 1,600 pages. So those books are quite chunky. And then if you're looking for some good fantasy trilogies that would be quick to get through, Book of the Ancestor and The Broken Earth were both fairly short as far as fantasy epic tales go. Of the books that I read this year, 29 were standalones and 32 books were books in a series. And then as far as genres, I had, as you can see, the significant majority of the books that I read were fantasy. And my next biggest chunk by far was science fiction, which is pretty typical for me. And then I had some nonfiction, mystery, poetry, historical, and general. So I have graphs that I made of all of those. So you can see here, I read 5 nonfiction books and 2 books of poetry. The poetry were definitely obviously the shortest books that I read. And then as far as nonfiction, I had 2 books about writing because I am an aspiring author. Braiding Sweetgrass was a book about plants and indigenous wisdom. Word Slut is a book about language and feminism. And The Sum of Us is a book about racism and the economic impacts of structural racism. Highly recommend every book on this sheet. Then as far as my kind of general pickings, I had 2 books that were mysteries. Finlay Donovan was kind of a mystery thriller, and Then There Were None was a cozy mystery. Historical fiction, I had 2. The Monkey Wrench Gang, I think could be just general fiction, but it's old enough now that it could be historical fiction as well. And then Pachinko, which is definitely historical fiction. Squirrel Six Chipmunk was a series of short stories that were humorous. And I put general for Picture of Dorian Gray. I guess it kind of has some magical realism to it, but it's a classic and I didn't really know where to put it. So honestly, my worst reads of the year are all on this slide. Every single one of these was either a 3-star or a 2-star read, which isn't surprising because I was trying to branch out and do some different things beyond my favorite genres, which are obviously fantasy and sci-fi, and didn't get a lot of winners. So in 2023, I obviously do want to keep branching out and read diverse genres. I want to try a couple more thrillers and maybe try a romance or 2. I'm not really sure, but I do love historical fiction in general, but I don't think I'm going to give mysteries another go anytime soon because I didn't really enjoy either of those. So obviously my most read genre was fantasy. I read 30 fantasy books this year and I have all of them up on the screen now. These are in no particular order whatsoever other than I tried to keep all of the series grouped together. None of these books were less than 3 stars. Most of them were 4 or 5 stars. And then my science fiction, I read 18 books this year. Literally half of the science fiction that I read in 2022 was the Expanse series because that is 9 books long. And then I had the Siberiad and Exhalation were both collections of short stories. These Prisoning Hills is a novella. The 22 Murders of Madison May is a thriller. Frankenstein is a classic. And Lovecraft Country is a horror. And then Lark Ascending and Station 11 are both kind of like apocalyptic dystopian style books. So those are kind of the subgenres. Project Hail Mary and the Expanse series are both more like space opera-esque. So those are my genres that I read in 2022. And then just another stat that the Literature Science Alliance, I noticed in some of her videos, keeps track of the gender and race of the authors that she reads from. And I thought that was an interesting metric to start tracking for my own curiosity. And so I made this graph. So you can see orange is the number of books and maroon is the number of authors. And then I just have the physical number and the percentage to go with each of those. So I read 32 books by white men this year, which was 52% of the books overall. I read from 17 different white male authors, which made up 45% of the total authors that I read. And then using BIPOC to just include any non-white persons. I only read 2 books by men of color this year, and that was from 2 different male authors. So that is definitely something that I need to work to read more of in 2023. And then as far as white women, I read 16 books written by white women this year, which was 26% of the overall books that I read. I read from 12 different white female authors, which was 32% of the total number of authors that I read. And then I read 11 books from women of color, which was 18% of the overall books that I read. And I read from 7 different women authors of color, which was 18% of the number of authors that I read. So this was enlightening to me because I can see that my reading is heavily skewed towards white men. And I would like to have that be a little bit more balanced. I know that publishing as an institution has historically also skewed that direction, but there is plenty of other opportunities to read from more diverse voices. And so I would like to make an effort to do that in the future. And then I just have a bunch of random stuff that I put together. So excluding nonfiction, the highest average rating for a book that I read on Goodreads this year was Tiamat's Wrath by James S.A. Corey, which is book number 8 of The Expanse. That was also, I think, my favorite book in the Expanse series, but I was surprised to see it as the highest rated fiction book that I read this year. So that was really interesting. And then the lowest average rating on Goodreads book that I read this year was Squirrel Seeks Chipmunk. And I'm really surprised by that. I thought this was a cute, fast little read. And I definitely read some books that were way worse than this year. So it surprised me that this was the worst rated book that I read in 2022. The oldest book that I read this year was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which came out, technically the first edition of Frankenstein came out in 1818, but the version that I read was the one that was republished in 1831. So 1831 is the oldest book that I read this year, and the newest book that I read this year was Lark Ascending by Silas House, which just came out in September. Now this is interesting because I excluded my collections of poetry because poetry collections are obviously very short. But of the other books that I read, my longest book was The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, which is the second book in the Kingkiller Chronicles. And the shortest book that I read was These Prisoning Hills by Christopher Rowe, which is a novella. I did think it was interesting, though, that Goodreads and Storygraph, I think, had different stats for, I think Goodreads says that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was actually the longest book that I read. So I'm not sure what the page difference discrepancy is there, but I found that to be interesting. This last graphic, I have the most mismatched Goodreads rating. So where were our differences really drastic? And Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, at the time that I read it, had a 4.28 rating on Goodreads, and I gave this 2 stars. I did not enjoy this book whatsoever. And then the most underrated book on Goodreads that I read this year, A Natural History of Dragons, which is the first book in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, only has a 3.84 average rating on Goodreads, and I gave it 5 stars. I absolutely adored this book. So now I'll get into some of my Goodreads wrap-up kind of stuff. My year in books. I think, like I said, I think the page count is different on Storygraph. Yeah, Storygraph says I read 26,193 pages. And Goodreads says I read 26,414 pages. So I don't know why that difference is. They both know I read the same books. So who knows? But according to Goodreads, the shortest book that I read was a collection of poetry, The Herding Kind by Ada Limon, which was excellent. And the longest book was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clark. I actually had a physical copy of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell in hardback, and it was like 800 something pages. So that's why I didn't include it in the graphic that I made earlier. My average book length in 2022 was 433 pages, which is not surprising. And then I found this really interesting. My most shelved book was The Picture of Dorian Gray, which doesn't surprise me because that's a classic. And I think probably a lot of people have read that or been required to read it over the course of their lives. And then my least shelved book is These Prisoning Hills by Christopher Rowe, which I just read. Like I said, it's a very short novella and it just came out this year, but it is like an Appalachian dystopian kind of apocalyptic science fiction. And it was super rad. So definitely more people should be picking up this book. My average rating for 2022 was a 4.3, and I think that checks out. I had a phenomenal reading year and loved most of the books that I read. And then my highest rated on Goodreads was The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. It has a 4.65 average, which, like I said, I didn't include that earlier because I was only including fiction. I feel like nonfiction is almost always rated higher than fiction because if you're looking for a certain topic and you find that topic and it's written well, you're probably going to give it 5 stars. And it's not kind of graded for people the same way that they think about a fictional story. But The Sum of Us was an excellent read. And then another thing that I really love that Goodreads keeps track of is the publication year. So you can see the oldest book that I read was Frankenstein, but I also had 4 other books that were older. And then there were none by Agatha Christie, Picture of Dorian Gray, which came out in 1890, The Siberiad, which came out in 1965, and The Monkey Ridge Gang, which came out in 1975. But pretty much everything else that I read was from the year 2000 or more recently, and you can see several of them actually even came out this year or the year before. So yeah, I've mostly trended towards more modern reads, but I did have at least 5 that kind of stuck out as outliers. The very last stat that I'm going to talk about today is my number of books and pages over time. So I just find this interesting. So the red line is pages read and blue line is books read. My lowest months, according to this, were February and April. I only read 2 books both of those months. And I don't think that's surprising at all. I was coming off of a multi-year reading slump, as I've mentioned previously on the channel, and the fact that I was reading any books at all was really exciting. And I considered myself as having read like 3 books each of those months, because both of those months I picked up a 3rd book and nearly finished it, but didn't actually finish it until the next month. So, but it's funny because May is when I started my BookTube channel, and you can just see my trend from there. I read infinitely more the more into BookTube that I got as the year went on, and it turned out to end on a really high note. So like I said, in November, I technically read the most pages. That was right after my surgery. And so I was on recovery and could do nothing pretty much except sit around and listen to audiobooks. And then in December, I just had some time off around the holidays, and I read a lot of shorter things in December. That's why I got to read 10 books in this past month. Those are all my reading stats for 2022. I had a really great reading year, and I'm really looking forward to 2023. If you're watching this still, please let me know how many books you read this year and what you thought the most interesting stat that I shared was. Thank you all for watching. Please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come in 2023.